I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar from the American Nuclear Society's Risk-Informed, Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C we call it. My name is Prasad Kadambi and I'm chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about with purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act specifically recognizes a role for RIPB approaches. There is a lot of guidance available on RIPB approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with them because the conventional approaches still dominate most things that we do, including standards development. Right now, ANS can be considered as a knowledge center for RIPB approaches. RP3C initiated these community of practice webinars on RIPB to enable practitioners of RIPB approaches to share their knowledge and experience. Today, we will hear about an area where we need modernization to support the cause of advanced reactors. That area is international harmonization for specifying requirements so that global deployment becomes a reality. We will hear from Cyril Draffin of the US Nuclear Industry Council on this. Cyril, could you please take over?
Sure, I'm glad to join you all, particularly the motivated people on the Friday afternoon before the holidays. I'm the Senior Fellow for Advanced Nuclear at U.S. Nuclear Industry Council. I'm also the lead for the Department of Commerce's Standards and Regulations Workstream, which is part of the SMR working group. So what I'd like to do, starting on the next slide, is kind of give you an overview of two kind of driving forces in putting in context the kind of good work you do on analysis and standards collaboration. The first one is on what's the driving forces for deployment, because obviously that's the goal for getting all the things regulated. And so I'm going to talk about what exists now, some of the new technologies that are coming, some of the driving forces, and then touch upon some of the markets. And then we'll have a little chat to see if you have any particular clarifying questions on the market for advanced nuclear. Then second, we'll talk about the international regulatory collaboration context. We'll start with goals. What are the some goals that we've established and some other groups are working on, and then talk about the many activities underway looking at regulatory harmonization and standards harmonization worldwide, and touch upon some issues at the end, and then have an open dialogue. So that will be the kind of the lay of what our discussions will be. I'll start on the next slide, which is the first of maybe 8 slides on the nuclear deployment, and then we'll have a total of 25 slides this afternoon to touch upon all the topics. So this is looking at markets and technologies and financing, and on the next slide, we'll start delving into that. This is an array of countries that have nuclear energy use. And you'll find it varies a great deal in terms of percentages. The little boxes, I'll call your attention to those to start with. On the upper left corner of France, 70%, large amount. Ukraine, this is of course Ukraine before the war, about 50%. US about 20%, and China 5%, but growing. But you can see that there's a lot of countries that have had nuclear. These are basically large 1,000 megawatt pressurized or boiling water reactors, but it means that they have regulatory experience with nuclear, either themselves or because they've kind of collaborated with others. And so that's a starting point for deploying small modular reactors and having licenses granted by them. So they have some experience. And there's also a number of other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, that don't necessarily have that experience. And so that becomes a challenge for the regulators, both in that country, and then comparing notes with other countries about how they're proceeding. And that's what we'll be getting in the second part of the discussion. But I just thought this would be a helpful array for you looking at the world. If you then move on to the next slide, we'll look at what the technologies are. And I'll spend a few minutes on this because it's got a lot of details on it, some of which you probably are quite familiar with, but some you may not be. So the right-hand side are the small modular reactors, both the water-cooled, which some people call Generation 3, and then the Generation 4, which could be high-temperature gas-cooled reactors or sodium reactors or molten salt reactors. And what you'll see on the right-hand side, those four columns, they vary in size, they vary in coolant, and they vary in manufacture. Now, some of them have gotten licensed, like NuScale, 77 megawatts, and they would maybe have a 4-pack or a 6-pack, where you'd buy 4 of them together, and they're talking to a number of countries, both for electrical and industrial applications for their product. Rolls-Royce is trying to build up momentum in the UK. GE Hitachi is moving forth both in the United States and Canada, and also in Europe. For their water-cooled reactor. Holtec has just signed an agreement with the Ukrainians to put that in their units in that country, which obviously has a need for it, and Westinghouse. So this gives you an idea of some of the water-cooled ones that are out there and their sizes, and then the ones on the TerraPower and X-Energy are funded by the Department of Energy and having demonstrations planned, X-Energy and with Dow and TerraPower at a coal mine site. On the left-hand side, are 4 example modular small reactors, microreactors. Some are mobile, like BWTX, which signed with the Department of Defense for their kind of mobile defense applications, and they'll probably get bigger over time. And some of the other smaller ones, which also are available in the or will be in the marketplace after they get licensed. So, and then at the bottom, I just point out that if you wanted to hear more about reactors worldwide, the Nuclear Energy Agency this year put out a report kind of documenting what's occurring worldwide, China, Russia, and other places, with other manufacturers that are working on small modular reactors, other advanced reactors. So if you roll to the next slide, you'll see that there's the driving forces for it are zero carbon goals, certainly in the Europe and in the United States and other parts of the world. Geostrategic for US technologies, particularly vis-a-vis Russia and China. China is putting in a large number of electrical reactors for electricity, and they also have started one for industrial process heat. They're working on one for petrochemicals, and which they hope to be finished in a couple of years. So they're moving out, and we need to keep up with them and be competitive. And finally, job creation in the United States and worldwide as we install these devices. At the bottom of the page, you see some of the US programs to support exports. The Export-Import Bank, which has been actively involved in talking with other countries, making commitments, already billion-dollar commitments for nuclear energy. The International Finance Corporation. The US Department of State, with their first program, reaches out and has joint cooperation and funding of countries to apply to build up regulatory capacity. US Department of Commerce has a Gold Key program, an advanced and advocacy program. Trade and Development does work in grant funding for countries to build up their capabilities for regulations. The DOE Loan Program Office has lots of money for reactor manufacturers and for manufacturing. So the next slide is some of the reports have been put out. I mentioned the first one on a dashboard listing all the reactors. The liftoff report for advanced nuclear is very positive, very good. that DOE put out in March of this year. And they just had a discussion this week on their fifth one, which will be on industrial decarbonization, where nuclear has a role to play. And then there's a couple of studies at the bottom, national academies for advanced reactors that people felt generally positive about in terms of being accurate and laying out the, probably without too much insight, but at least with clarity, the opportunities. And then the roadmap that EPRI and NEI is working on has a component for standards collaboration for ANS, which is involved, and others, ASME and some of the standards organizations. And so that's worth referring to in terms of some of the, it's early stage, but is a lay of the land. On the next slide, you'll see a, just pointing out that for electricity, TVA and Ontario Power and Romanian utilities have made commitments. Same thing for Dow and Nucor, which is one of the larger steel companies like arc furnaces. They were at the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council's summit this past week. We done this week before, and we're very positive, CEO, COO, and others, about why industrial process heat makes sense in electricity for the steel industry and for them, and that's good. And then the small remote facilities. And there are problems, some issues, and including the supply chain, but the companies are working on that to try to address. So the final slide in this section is a map of Canada, just to give you a kind of visual presentation of where they think, they have a strategic map, roadmap, that they could use nuclear in terms of mining, in terms of coal-fired replacement, for heavy industries and chemicals, and even in remote communities in Canada, which is probably more like a microreactor. So I just thought just a visual presentation. We started with countries, and we'll get down to this kind of array of where things could be used. So I thought I'd pause here for just a moment to see if people had comments or questions on the driving forces, essentially the market and financing for advanced nuclear.
You're welcome to ask questions by unmuting yourself also, if you wish.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go on then, and you can be reflecting on things that you'd like to know more about, or perspectives you had if you've dealt with some of these issues. So on nuclear international collaboration, I'm going to start with goals and outcomes desired. And so in the next slide, what you'll see is the kind of phases that people anticipate. Currently we're in phase one, where you're kind of aligning existing activities. There's bilateral and trilateral discussions among some of the regulators to understand how they approach information, sharing terms, kind of the basic stuff of coordination. The step beyond that would be to say, okay, here's agreement on key safety criteria, and that people start accepting not the whole package, but components of it, that the analysis done by one regulator would be valuable and beneficial for others. And so the regulators working together in, if you will, building blocks of how they put their application together. And the phase three, which is really more aspirational than probably anything we'll see in the next 5 or even 10 years, would be that one regulator approves the other regulator's approval. And that would be desirable, but a big step. Next slide is talks about some specifics that the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council talked about and discussed, and also in coordination with the World Nuclear Association. We want the regulations to be efficient in time and resources, that you allow subsequent license applications for similar identical ones to be done quickly, that there's co-certification or co-approval, that utilities work with, and the developers work with the regulators in multiple countries. They may go through concurrent agreements, which is being tried for GE Hitachi, for Canada and the United States, and in Europe, and also over in Europe with the New World approach the EDF is taking with 3 different countries. And then that you'd have agreement on levels review and methodologies used and standards that use that people could rely upon, regulators could rely upon for being consistent. And then the goal is that you result in a single cost-effective design that can be deployed cost-effectively using in a manufacturing situation, so you're not tweaking it, you're building it, and you're building it efficiently and with a good supply chain and reliably. And so that's what we want to get to as a goal, and then recognizing there's going to be site-specific approvals, but you don't want to have them too arduous by each country for their particular site. And then finally, to share regulatory and operational lessons learned. Next slide would be in the same vein. What would be the approach that should be taken? It's going to be a phased approach, as we saw in the slides of the 3 phases, but to build off multilateral and trilateral, and that's what we're starting with. And I indicated that the France and Sweden and the Czech Republic are working on one design in Europe, and then in North America, plus with UK and Poland, are working on another design with BW RX300, which is a boiler water reactor, 300 megawatt size. That's the starting point. International collaboration for newcomer countries. IAEA and NRC are working out to help them. International Standards Organization, yourselves, ASME, CSA, NRC, various other standards organizations you see listed there. Cordell, the World Nuclear Association, is actively looking at that. ISO standards. So there's a lot of players, but you need to have collaboration there. And then information dissemination and lessons learned from what happens. And then finally, to actually be able to tangibly, show that you've addressed items in the regulatory and design process and other regulators are accepting that, and that you basically have building blocks that you can rely upon can be directly used by other regulators. So you can read the more detail afterwards, because those slides will be available. But I think for now, we'll move on. And we'll now move into from goals and outcomes. And by the way, other people are working on it. NEI is also working on something in this regard. Hope to have some white papers, and IAEA is also have some internal discussions, and as a World Nuclear Association. So regulatory collaboration. The buzzword, I guess the thought is harmonizing the harmonizers. Each one wants to do a good job, but the problem is they're kind of always tripping over each other, or kind of like multiple Venn diagrams, and there's not as much cohesion perhaps as we would hope. So I'm going to show some slides here, which we've coordinated with the World Nuclear Association. Start with IAEA. They're obviously big, worldwide. It's the International Atomic Energy activities. They have a regulatory approach, which is at the top, the working groups for including pre-licensing regulatory reviews. And they have an industrial group that's just looking at, I particularly draw your attention to topic 2 on the kind of the bottom right, information sharing on codes and standards. So they're looking at that. They're looking at testing and safety evaluation. They're looking at infrastructure. They're looking at harmonization. There's a number of U.S. companies, representatives that are involved in these activities. And so it's a worldwide activity. It's not, including Russians and others. And so they're trying to share information. Their progress, some people think, has been limited. But this week, June 27th, they started their plenary session. The lead for the organization, Mr. Grossi, talked about the 9 benefits. And so that's available to you. So that's just basically probably the biggest and best known one. And it's particularly helpful for smaller countries that don't have a regulatory experience, and they're just trying to listen in to learn from it. We'll go on to the next one, which is the European Union SMN partnerships. They have 5 work streams. Those work streams are getting close to being finished. They expect to have a report any day now Their goal was to have it done today. I haven't seen it yet, but it'll be coming out soon. And they are looking at licensing and financing, supply chain, R&D, and then they're going to have a stakeholder event in Brussels in October, where they're basically going to allow anybody who wasn't involved, which include some of you, that they could attend and hear more. Now, hopefully the reports will be sufficient, but some people do plan on going there in person. I don't know whether it's going to be also have a web hybrid meeting or not, but it's something to be aware of because it brings all the utilities and regulators and other people together in Europe and trying to have cohesion there, which is an important step in the process. The next one to talk about would be Cordell. Cordell is part of the World Nuclear Association's efforts in cooperation, reactor design, evaluation, and licensing. It's a good group. Alan Carson does a good job. We have a number of US people who have been actively engaged in that. I'd say they're probably the best non-governmental organization who's involved in collaboration. They have a number of segments to it, and I'll read them. Mechanical codes and standards, digital instrumentation and control, nuclear safety standards, small modular reactors, licensing and permitting, and design change management. And I think you'd want to connect with them. I assume some of you, and maybe you might volunteer if you have been involved in the mechanical codes and standards activities that they've been working on. I would assume that ANS people have been or should be involved in that. They have working groups, somewhat like you have, communities of practice, leaders from different countries and companies that try to work through the details on how to approach these things. And the challenge is manpower. They have many more ideas and things to work on and coordinate and to share information than they have staff, which are basically volunteers, to do. A similar issue you have. But the more we can be cohesive in that, and it includes issues of making sure that when people are having specs that was it going to be metric, and you don't knock out the English system. You don't want to have O-ring kind of problems on a spacecraft. You want to have consistency in the codes also, that it's not just the standards of the regulated groups, but also what happens with the software in terms of the analysis tools that's used in the United States, done by the national labs. Will they be acceptable overseas? Will people want to do their own analysis? How do you share data? How is information shared? Just the NRC just changed from having to put a bunch of little pieces into one big batch for their applications. How do you share code data? How do you share output with other regulators? There's questions of proprietary nature of the information. There's questions of just logistical. How do you share information? How do you feed one to the other? And so these are the kinds of challenges that these regulatory groups and collaboration groups like Cordell are grappling with. And for small modular reactors, which I think was headed by Peter Hastings from the US, Kairos, and there's other people from NuScale and GE Hitachi who's been actively involved, Michelle Katz, for instance. And so this is probably a group that's probably most useful, and you'd want to coordinate with them. And if anybody wants contacts, they're happy to provide that to any of you. So we've now looked at a couple cross-cutting things. And I guess someone just popped in with a question: how do you want to be on a standard subcommittee? You volunteer. If you want to be on the World Nuclear Association ones, let me know and I'll put you in touch with Alan Carson. They have names of each of the leads. You can contact the leads or vice chair of each of the 6 working groups at World Nuclear Association. IAE is a little bit more complicated because it's an international body. It's a little more arduous, and you sometimes have to flow through national organizations. So it depends. But that shouldn't be an impediment if people are interested and qualified and interested to serve. And I point out that they do have meetings a couple times a year, like they had one in the, I believe it's the January, February timeframe of this year in London. And the next one is going to, the working groups will be in September of the beginning of September 4th to 6th in London. So that'll be the next kind of working group meetings. But all the individual groups meet on a regular basis. They don't wait for the big meetings to make progress. So on the next slide, I'm going to touch upon two what I'll call European sub-organizations. This is a group of, as you can see, vendors and other organizations involved in energy in Europe. They've had funding. This is the first start, which is they looked at licensing activities. And they have a project website, and you can look at Elsmore to see what they've done. It's as I point out, it's a little more regional and probably doesn't have quite the clout of the SMM partnership that is being done in Europe. But it's a good building block. It has a number of people involved. And it flows into the next part, which is they've talked about how do you license it. And then they talked about, on the next slide, how do you look at markets? And so the first activity rolled into the second activity and has some of the same organizations involved. This started just a few months ago, and they are looking at how do you apply modular reactors, particularly hybrid systems. They're looking at electricity and heat and hydrogen. Hydrogen is something they're talking a lot about there. And so they're trying to say, okay, how do you have create an environment to put a hybrid system in with SMRs and tying into regulation. So it's just in the early stage in terms of progress they've made, but they're trying to look at both the regulatory side as well as the market side in terms of deployments. On the next slide is a couple points on multilateral initiatives. And these are probably the most promising and the most near term. So what is done, US, NRC, and CNSC in Canada have been coordinating, taking small steps, and they have a series of projects that they've been working on what they call under the Memorandum of Cooperation. They've looked at TRISO fuel. They've looked at some of the X-energy designs. They've looked at 3 or 4 manufacturers in terms of just small components or portions to see how the two organizations could work together. So it's a kind of a building trust, understanding people. They've actually started to swap people back and forth. So someone from Canada will be down at NRC and vice versa. And so this is tangible. They've moved from the leadership, which is quite positive about working together. And Amita Velshi is a world champion in that, in terms of among the regulators. But they're trying to move from senior leadership and support to staff interactions and progress. And so they tried to move on to the next organization, which is using GE Hitachi to BWR X300 as a case study. So Ontario Power, which is the utility, and CNSC, and TVA, which is the utility in the US, plus NRC, are working with GE Hitachi to work through the details. They're still in the starting phase. They hope to have this. The concept is that the goal is to make it an efficient process. So it's you get one approved, the other was looking at the same time, and so they can basically approve it at around the same time and go forth, and they share information to make it more efficient. To date, it's been more building relationships, which makes it good for cooperation, but not necessarily for efficiency. But people think it's a wise investment to move forward. And the reason for spending some time on this is that they're more likely to result in near-term success than the big multi-country activities of IAEA, which are a bit ponderous, important but ponderous, and are not going to necessarily have results in the time frame by the end of this decade that's needed to try to get these things licensed in multiple countries and deployed. A similar, I talked about the US. I wanted to also talk about what's happening in Europe, where France leading the activities with EDF as their a key company that they supported with a newer design, also water-based. It's working, and I by the way should point out that before I leave that they also have the UK and the Polish and other people who are listening in, joining in the meetings, not equal contributors back in the GE Hitachi one, but also engaged, and they may expand that over time. They want to be selective, including other regulatory groups. So it could become a kind of a larger consortium if it's effective for that, the first one. The same thing may be true of the second one, which is France has reached out to Finland and the Czech Republic. They're looking at safety objectives, design, basis conditions, passive cooling, development plan for computer codes, verification and validation, and multiple module sensing, location, and safety assessments, which is important to you. And you've obviously, this committee has thought about that. So I wanted just to spend a little time on these new, what I'll call trilateral, bilateral activities, because they really are the near-term building blocks for harmonization of regulatory activities. So the next slide is a transition to mention a few more, just kind of how does it come together, a couple issues, and then we'll do a wrap up, and then an opportunity for you to comment and question, and I'll circle back for those comments that I haven't picked up in the chat yet. So next slide. This is a one-page snapshot of harmonization activities that are underway, and there's still work to do. And I've touched upon most of these already, but I just thought it'd be helpful to capture it all on one page, and some indication of achievements. It's an eye of the beholder, and they vary over time. But I thought it'd be just interesting to you to look at what was done on the regulatory collaboration. And I mentioned the World Nuclear Associations and the Cordell Working Group doing as being an industry effort, working with the coordinators, and also the owner-operators are working on issues. EPRI is looking at issues. There's codes and standards, which I talked about earlier, which activity is underway and will continue. So if people want to share what their perspectives are on that in a moment, that would be helpful as well. So if you go on to the next slide, these are just an area of focus. It gives you an indication, looking back a few years, of the SMR Regulators Forum. This is an early stage activities from 2017 to 20, just to kind of put in context some of the issues that have been looked at for many years. And on the right, I'm not going to read them to you, but you can see what they have in mind and how IAEA and the NRC and the UK regulatory group has been looking at these things, and you're a player in that as well. So I just thought I'd just kind of show this for a little, kind of another snapshot of how they have put out documents to work together. On the next slide is kind of the wrap up. I presented the approach earlier in the discussion that U.S. Nuclear Industry Council had recommended, but I thought I'd put color coordinating in to see, just my perspective. This is mine. This is not the official one, of how they've done. Phased approach, they're making progress. The multilateral, they did a good job of getting started. We haven't seen the results, so you could shade that as a light green, but they're getting started. And regulatory collaboration for newcomers, NRC's reaching out to a number of countries. I mentioned State Department is funding the first program to fund some of the regulators to build up expertise, particularly in US technology. IAEA has conferences and people can go in and listen to how things could be done. And so there really has been an active outreach for newcomer countries. And also, although I started out the presentation with those cute little country colors, those are mostly the large reactors. And just because the regulator is familiar with an AP1000 doesn't mean they understand the small reactors, and they certainly don't know all the different technologies. So in some cases, they may not be newcomer countries, but some of the regulators may be newcomers to the advanced reactor technology. So so far, those are positive. So I've given it green, but it's it's more of a initial burst of enthusiasm rather than seeing good tangible results yet. On the next batch is the codes and standards. So it's, they've had some discussions, but I really have, you can provide your perspective, but it's still in the early stages. There's desire to share information and also that means lessons learned. The NRC tries to capture how they do lessons learned. In some cases, when they did the NuScale application, it took them about a year, which is a long time, to get around to writing their lessons learned from that. But the goal is to share lessons learned, information on their assessments, on the technologies, maintaining proprietary information appropriately. But it's early stage in terms of getting much cooperation done and sharing those kinds of lessons learned. And then over time, it'll be just not licensing, it'll be construction and operation. And so that's early stage, and really not much has been done in major building blocks or regulatory reviews. That's why I color coded them red. And then the final slide before we open up for conversation is just a kind of a recap. You want effective collaboration among the people who are involved. That includes the regulators, it includes the utilities, it includes the developers, it includes also the supply chain to make sure they can meet these specs and guidelines. And so you've been involved in that, lots of other people involved in that. And I'm not, obviously I didn't get to all the details that was available in the time that's allowed, but that's an early stage activity. Deployment, there's a lot of activity and interest among the utilities, among industrial applications that I mentioned, NuScale and steel and Dow Chemical. There was a number for process heat and electricity. There's a lot of requirements in the petrochemical, chemical industry. There's desire to have carbon sequestration, but in order to do that, takes energy, and you don't really want to burn fossil fuel to do that. That kind of defeats the purpose. So that's a possibility. There may be biorefineries. There can be bio substances together, and then nuclear to process that. That's an idea that Charles Forsberg and MIT has. And so there's a lot of deployment ideas, and there's a lot of demos underway in the United States and in China for industry and industrial and utility applications, but also is how to get an nth of a kind, how to get reliable manufacturing in industrial plants, and it takes a lot to do that. And then there's new customers, even like and new business models if you groups like Microsoft and others come in. So I will pause there and kind of open up for questions. I will look at the chat to see if I can pick up some of those as we go. But in the meantime, people are welcome to, I turn it back to Patricia, to Pat, and to see how you want to handle questions or comments.
Prasad, you want me to go ahead and take it?
Yeah, go ahead, Pat. Let's just begin with the first question. Cyril, if you would just briefly address each question. There are quite a few, so we'll try to cover all of them. So
sure.
Go ahead,
so
Pat.
For where does the U.S. get most of their uranium ore? It's overseas. There's other, there's a little bit in the United States, but not much. The big issue is not really the ore as much, and there's some congressional funding opportunities to expand that. The big challenge is that for low enriched uranium, that comes from Russia, and HALEU comes from Russia. And so that's been a major problem. That's why DOE has on the street 2 RFPs, one for enrichment and one for changing that uranium hexafluoride into oxides and metals. and that's funded like 700 million, and there's another potential 2.1 billion that has been marked up in the House in terms of augmenting HALU funding. So most of the uranium ore is overseas, mostly, but from countries that we can continue to work with. It's not just from Russia, but the HALU, it really is the bigger question. On the standardization, how are they dealing with different units? I don't have a definitive. Obviously, the ones in Europe are using metric. The ones in the United States have to be ready to do it overseas, and so I think they're moving that direction. But I must admit, I haven't interrogated each vendor to find out how they're handling it. But I think that is important. I'm going to just pause for a moment, since Dennis Henneke has his hand raised. I'll see what he'd like to say before I go to the next question.
Sure. Dennis, go ahead.
Well, we're starting in Canada, so metric, yeah. I was going to talk about some other items. So.
Oh, sure, go. You can ask your question on other items, but I assume you're doing it in. Well, once you tell us what metric, yeah.
Yeah, Canadians, yeah. But I did want to talk about the harmonization aspect and two things. One is you had the listing for the Canada U.S. harmonization on the X300, and I think you'll see that the Polish are also watching over our shoulder, and the UK is starting to watch also. But that's more than just watch. For Poland, they're watching the review. They have access to all the documents. They have started providing comments, but every document that's being reviewed, all the regulators involved can provide comments. So they're all being a participant in it, even though there may be one lead on an LTR, which, most of the LTRs are going to the NRC, or on the SAR, for example, that's the CNSC. But everybody gets equal access. And I'll say CNSC said they would finish their review in 2 years for the construction permit. And they were not fully staffed up to be able to do that. The only way they're going to be successful is because the NRC is doing half the review for them. So I would say that's, really successful right now, and it's going to help us when we go to Poland, and then so on and so forth. So I think we can report it was really successful. So any of the vendors going out there to get licensed in one particular country, and when you go into a second country, get your regulators to talk to each other and work together. It's just a great lesson learned. The other one, so I'm not a fan of the harmonizer comment because it doesn't really mean anything. I can tell you what has worked the most is, yes, Cordell, they have funding, and they're working on a couple of areas. The one that you mentioned is the most successful right now is standards. That's different than what this organization be wanting to do, which is standardize all the standards, right, to make them all look the same. But that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is comparing standards and going through them and saying, okay, if you meet ASME code whatever in the US and you go to Europe, then this code over here is almost the same with the following differences. Or if you go to Japan, this is their code, and this is what's similar or what's different. Now, I won't go requirement by requirement, but we're going to look at it in pretty much detail. Now, they are working with the IAEA, who has the multiple working groups, and there's one on standards. And so the two of them working together, and the reason that works is because the volunteers come from the IAEA, and the IAEA pays for their travel, and then they go to these working meetings. And so you get technical people showing up in working meetings, and Cordell has people like Alan and others who are doing the work behind the scenes. So that standard working group, They're going to start with mechanical standards and go to the next and so on. It's a slow process, but it's going to be successful. It will be very helpful for us when we're going to some country that has a set of standards that we're not used to. So that's pretty useful. Some of the other working groups are not so useful, but that particular one is, and it's really because Cordell is working with the IAEA. And so that's really what harmonizers mean, is that the different groups working on harmonization, NEA, OECD, Cordell, whatever it happens to be, EU, that they work together to support each other and then also complement each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, Dennis, to give those examples.
We have quite a few questions in the chat. But Cyril, do you want Pat to read them out one at a time so you can address them?
I can read them.
Okay.
If someone wants to volunteer in a standards committee, what's the process? It really, as I mentioned already, it depends on which group you want to be part of. If it's part of Cordell, which I recommend, and I think Dennis recommends, you could contact either of us and we can put you in touch. If it's some of the other ones, just let me know and I can and reach out. With regards to the International Nuclear Regulatory Collaboration, the lessons learned documented so groups can glean information. Well, again, it's on a case-by-case basis, and what we've described as these bilateral ones are much better in being tangible progress. There's no central clearinghouse where people put in, to my knowledge, of information on standards. So it tends to be piece parts. On the universal roadblocks that they're running into, well, the number one is probably just manpower. Volunteers are willing to do things. I'll let other people comment on it, but I haven't seen the standards committees, although someone else referred to the DTRA standards side. On the regulations, you do want to be careful on the supply chain that you don't have different standards that limit your ability to do that. So that's a quite quick answer. We'll circle back if there's more time on that one. The Export Control and Informational Pact, Billy Newcomer. Well, first of all, in the U.S., you need a 1, 2, 3 agreement to share, and they have them with most countries, but not all. And that's probably number one. U.S. is much more persnickety about non-proliferation than, let's say, the Chinese are. And so that's it's something we need to deal with carefully, even though it is somewhat of an impediment. You do have to go through reviews, and sometimes the State Department reviews can take a long time. So that is a problem, and that includes even personnel. And there's even some issues between how you get U.S. and Canada to work together because of who's considered an employee. I won't go into the details, but there's a problem just between those two countries. You wouldn't think it would be in terms of nationalities. The Europeans were interested in including sorts of it's probably a different emphasis. It's also a difference in regulator. It's not all the Europeans don't move with one mind, and all the regulators there don't move in one area. And I think some of the skepticisms that some of the countries had in Germany and other places to nuclear and wanted to be, now they've seen the problems with relying on Russian gas and environmental issues. And so a lot of there's more pressure to be more flexible when in the past there have been probably pressure to limit nuclear. And so I don't see that there's a huge difference yet in terms of technical between Europe and the United States. It depends on the regulators. Pat's obviously helping out too. And then maybe there's more messages. Pat, we can pick up from there.
I think that was it, because the last one is just me letting individuals know if they did want to contact either you or Dennis Henneke to get involved, they can go through me if they don't have your contact information. I think you did cover it though, Prasad. Did you see anything?
No, I think, Cyril, you did cover the questions that I was able to identify. I have a question myself, if you don't mind. If you go to slide 11, where you had the pyramid, I'm really interested in what you identify as phase 3 there. At this point, you say that it's not likely, and I fully agree that, we don't see much going on there right now. But if I think about what, NEMA, that's the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, calls for by way of a technology inclusive framework, if we are able to succeed in that in this country, would you agree, Cyril, that that might go a long way towards moving from phase 2 to phase 3 at some point in the future?
I think it's probably more the attitude of the international regulators than it is something that U.S. does. They like to keep their autonomy. That's important to them. They maybe rely upon other people's assessments, and certainly the newcomers value NRC's opinion. But NRC still hasn't coalesced. Even with NEMA, they haven't coalesced, and we don't want a situation where they're going to wait for that to occur. So it may be. So part of the issue is if you want to have something like that done, it has to be done concurrently with other regular. You basically have an example of a applicant that's going through using that process that you just referred to, and that gets done between a couple of different regulators, maybe in the U.S. and Europe at the same time. And that case study of how to get it done is probably more likely to result in near-term movement than just for us to come up with, here's our perfect solution and you and Europe ought to accept it. The French don't see it that way, the French regulators. Dennis?
Dennis, you had a question?
No, well, I was going to clarify. I think the big fish on phase 3 is universal regulatory review. Now, it's not to say that countries don't have their specific requirements, but if we could take now X300 is too slow, but or too quick. But if we were to take a reactor like X300 and we do an IAEA review and license. So they phase 2 defines what all that criteria is, and then there's a process by which we do this one-time review. Then we can go into Zimbabwe, and then Zimbabwe can add their things to it and so on. But they don't have to review again our safety analysis or our containment analysis or so on. That's the big fish. That's what the regulatory track is trying to get to in the IAEA and with WNA. So a lot of people are skeptical, but we're going to keep pushing to see if that's even possible. I think countries like the US are going to be, and the UK, are going to not want to give that up, but we shall see. It's a long-term goal.
Yeah, there's always going to be site-specific requirements, and so that's assumed. But you also want to make sure that the way that analysis done or that approach is also part of the package. So like Zimbabwe, pick that as an example, or more likely Uganda or Kenya that are more interested there, that they can use this kind of framework, maybe ask a couple questions, which is appropriate, and then have an approach for how they do the citing in terms of the analysis. So that doesn't become a problem at the very end. But moving toward there, it's as Dennis implied, getting it done for one reactor design doesn't mean it's going to work for a molten salt reactor. So each reactor's design is probably going to have to go through that same international process. And it may be up to the IAE, and it may be just an aggregate where there's enough utilities or countries that are signing on that it's becomes the de facto approach.
But Cyril, since there are a lot of multinational companies operating out of the US, that are involved in tackling a lot of these issues, is there any effort to bring these larger multinationals together, and do the sort of thing that Dennis suggested collectively with U.S. leadership?
Well, there's certainly, there's a couple ways of looking at it. Yes, you have companies like NewScale that are covering the world, talking to various countries that might be interested in buying their units, and because it's licensed. And you have other vendors doing the same thing. But they've raised the issues with their country's regulators about, what are the issues you've seen, and, trying to get state or NRC or other people to help coordinate that. So yes, that's a possibility by vendor. It's possible that you could have a company like Dow Chemical was a worldwide operation, or Nucor or somebody else commit to nuclear, in which case they would weave it into their designs and they would take it to the regulators, and that they would say we would operate it, and so therefore that might give them more of an international approach to get a group of U.S. companies that. But I haven't seen a consortium yet of U.S. companies going out to internationally. The general judgment has been it's better to have the U.S. government as the forward-leaning group to do that.
Thank you. Let's see. Brian Grimes had a question in the chat or comment. One way to increase standards effort is to earmark part of each grant for standards. I guess that's a suggestion. I think all of us would support that, especially the standards developing organization. Thanks, Brian, for the suggestion.
And I don't know that we got to Greg Hudson's question about whether Can-Do Energy.
Well, Can-Do and some of the companies and organizations behind it are clearly players in Canada. When I showed you the map of Canada, a lot of the utilities have that experience. The regulators have that experience. But I don't know if it's a company, a Can-Do Energy, I don't recognize that organization. But you have, in terms of Canada, you have probably 5 or 6 of the companies that I showed on that chart are active in Canada. ARC, for instance, I think today, ARC Clean Technologies announced an agreement to put it in Point Le Pro, their unit in Canada. And so there's probably 4 or 5 of these things. I could probably look up real time if need be.
Well,
but they don't have a mini version of a Can-Do like you had a mini version of BWR or the Westinghouse 300.
And just following up on Steve's note in the chat, Can-Do Energy is the current version of what used to be AECL, and it's a wholly owned subsidiary of SNC-Lavalin.
Okay, well, thank you very much all. We are at 4 o'clock. I try to keep our time, for these community of practice sessions. I want to thank Cyril again for, bringing to our attention a lot of these things that are going on, and I really appreciate everybody participating. Thanks again, Pat. Appreciate all the good work that enabled us to put on these sessions. And so I think if it's, Pat, we are at the end of the session at this point.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and stop recording.